Hello and welcome to part 6 of HTML Basics. In this video we'll be talking about tables. So tables are often used to display information a little bit more easily. So we have a table example here, and it's got information about a grocery bill, and it's been sorted, or it's been assembled here so that it's easier to read all of this information and see the relationship between each of these different categories, costs, and items, as well as display a total. If this is something you want to display on your website, you can do that. Let's jump over to Dreamweaver, and I've created a new file with a title called Table Example, and the file is called Tables. And I want to display this information. So I'm going to use some markup. Now we're going to be using the simple tags that are available in HTML5. If you are familiar with the way tables work in older versions of HTML, you may want to review the standard because the tags and the attributes for tables have taken a pretty big hit. A lot of them have been depreciated or are no longer part of the standard. So first, let's copy this information. We should talk about this for a minute before we jump over to Dreamweaver, just to identify what this table is made up of. Grocery bill is a caption. It's not really part of the tabular data, so it's important to note that it's a caption. It's part of the table in that sense, but it doesn't fit into any of these other cells. It doesn't have a specific relationship to any of the other domains in the table. The first row is a table row. A heading row. It contains all headings for our table. The bottom row is a footer. So you can see that it has a different format and has a different relationship with the items in the columns above it. So this is a table footer. Table header here, table footer here. We have some more headings here. We have orange, ham, and lunchable. And those headings relate to the information in the row. So whereas item represents the information in the column, in category is the heading for the information in that column, and then cost and taxable. Everything about orange is in the row. Produce $1 and no. Okay. So we would say the scope of this cell is it's a heading for the column. The scope of category heading is for the column. The scope of ham is for the row. Okay. A couple other things we have going on here. We have an empty cell down here. We're going to do that. We also have merged a row and a column. Two columns and two rows have been merged. And we can do that all in HTML. So let's jump over to Dreamweaver now and set this up. We begin with the table tag. Now tables have a lot of different tags that need to be nested. So if you're not familiar with nesting, you may want to review my previous video, which was part 5, HTML Basics. So the first thing in our table was the caption. Oops. And there is a caption tag. This one is called grocery bill. Go. That was easy. We preview, we can see that heading pop up, but we still don't have any of the rows, columns, cells. So our next item in our table is the first row, which we said was the table head. So there's a tag for that. It's called T-head. There we go. Now, inside T-head, we're going to spec the row, So there's one row there. TR. There we go. Still nothing showing up yet. And now we have 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. Item, category, cost, and taxable. There we go. Okay, so nothing is showing up because each of these are its own cell. So we have a tag that we need to use for that. Oops. These are heading cells, so we're going to use TH. There's 1, TH, 2, and 3. There we go. Now we can start to see our table coming together. Oops, there's one more. Taxable. There we go. We've got our taxable row. Okay. So after the T head, we're going to create our first regular row of information. So we need another TR for our second row. And that second row has 4 cells. So we're going to, let's just copy this. There we go. And we'll set up orange, produce, and 1. So orange, the category is produce, the cost is $1, and its taxable is no. Let's preview that. Okay, so you'll notice that it displayed in bold, which is how the headings are being rendered. Okay, so that bold actually just represents that as a heading. Now, produce, $1, and no are not headings. They are regular table cells or table domains. So the tag for that is TD. If you have a regular cell in a table, it is simply TD. And we've got a bunch of those, so we're going to use TDs here. There we go. Okay, so let's set up our second row. We're going to copy this and paste it. There's a lot of repetition here. So if we get one row working, there's no sense in recreating the wheel. We can just use that syntax. And there's one more item here. So we have 3 grocery items, orange, ham, and Lunchable. So this one is not an orange, it's a ham. And we have a Lunchable. Lunchables are taxable. Yes. 2. This one I think we said was, what was it? 4. This was meat, and this was frozen. Frozen foods. Just say frozen. Okay, it's looking pretty good. We can see the costs there. Taxable says no twice, and we're going to merge those, but first I'm going to finish coding my table, and then we'll get into how to span columns or merge cells, which is the language we use if we're using Excel or Microsoft Office or something. So the final row just has 2 cells, total and $7. So I'm just going to copy it like that. Okay. Now there's something else I missed, and that's that this final row is something special. This is the table footer. What was our total? $7. So, as our table footer, it requires a special tag, which is tfoot. Now, thethead tag and the tfoot tag does not change, or it doesn't typically apply any special presentational changes. So it's not displayed any different than any other row, but it does provide more semantic value. So it's a good idea to use them whenever they're appropriate. Okay, so now we have some issues with our table. Total needs to span across 2 columns. So this $7 should actually be underneath the cost column. We can do that by using an attribute called call_span. C-O-L, call for column, and span for, well, what we wanted to do here, merge them. We say it spans across 2 columns. So call_span is the attribute, and it equals 2, because we want it to span across 2 columns. 1, 2. There we go. And the final cell is just empty, which is what we wanted in our original example. Now, what about the word no here? We have no listed twice, and in our example, we span that across 2 rows. We can certainly do that. The first thing we want to do, though, is remove the second no. We just want to take that right out. And now it's empty, so we have the available space to span that top no with an attribute called rowSpan. I'm sure you could have predicted that. So we want this to span across 2 rows. 1, 2. There we go. Okay, now this looks like our example. We have the caption, the table head, which are all headings. The table, we have a heading orange, ham, lunchable, and the table footer, total. We're spanning just like we wanted it to. There's one last attribute I want to add to this, as long as we're talking semantic value, and that is the scope attribute. So when you're using headings in a table, you can use the scope attribute to just define the scope of that heading. So that might seem weird, but let's consider category here. The category is a heading, but it could be a heading for a row or a column. And we can tell that this is the heading for the column, but the computer can't, right? Because the browser is not human, and it can't guess, so it can only do what we tell it to do. So if we use the scope attribute to define the scope of this heading, then the browser will understand that, and potentially search engines would be able to make better use of or provide more information about the actual tabular data. So let's add that stuff in. So for this first row, each one of these headings the scope of them is column. They are headings for a column. So we're going to say scope equals, and the COL is the value for that. So let's copy this and we'll just paste it. Here we go. Right? And again, it doesn't change the way it looks in any way, but we're using HTML in these videos for structure. So we can add these in. So the next one, the scope of that, of orange is the heading for the row, for the orange row. So the scope of it is row. There we go. We're not going to add the scope attribute for this produce because that is not a heading. So we're only going to use the scope attribute on these heading cells. One last one. Ooh. This one down here. So we have our call_span, and then we have our scope. Okay, looks pretty good. Let's preview this, and yes, change that, save that. Okay. If you take a look, we can see our table, and it previews all the information is there, but we don't see the border. So let's turn the border on. That's the final attribute, which is border. So in the table tag, we can put border, and we can give this a value. This is the thickness of the border, or the weight. Save that and preview again. There we go. So now we can see that there's a border there. So the default setting in Internet Explorer was no border. And if you don't want a border to display, you simply delete that attribute and it will work. There we go. Okay, so let's mark up let's validate our code. As you can see, tables can be pretty confusing. The syntax is complex, and this is a simplified version. So granted, I've added a bunch of attributes that are not always used because they don't provide any presentational value, but we're just talking structure here. So even though this is a simple example of a simple table, there's a lot of nesting, and it's easy to make a mistake. So I'm going to copy this and validate it just to be sure. So I'm going to use the W3C markup validator, and that's at validator.w3.org. And I'm going to validate by direct input, and all I need to do here is just paste my code into that form and hit check. I have 3 warnings, but it passed. Checked as HTML5. Let's check out what those warnings are. Ah, okay. So, line 41, column 6, a table row was 3 columns wide, which is less than the column count established by the first row. So that's a good little catch. Of course, the reason for that is because line 41, it's because we're spanning the row above it. So it's a warning, not an error, which means that the syntax is still valid, but they want to give us a heads up just in case that was a mistake. And it was not. The same thing with the other 2 warnings. HTML5 conformance checker. HTML5 is still experimental according to this, so want us to be aware of that. And then when using direct mode, you don't need the UTF-8 character encoding, but I'm not going to delete it for this. So that's it. We've validated our code. We've created our working table example. And that completes our discussion on tables. Thank you for watching.